Hello students, welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Welcome to a session on economy this week, wherein we'll be taking up some of the very important articles that have appeared in various business related newspapers and we'll be analyzing these particular articles. For this particular video, I've chosen the time period from 6th of January to 12th of January 2020. And the articles that I've chosen are from Business Line, Hindu, Business Standard, Indian Express and Live Mint. Let's begin the discussion. The first article is related to regulating the urban cooperative banks. And very recently, in terms of regulating these particular banks, RBI has stated that they are going to introduce PCA-like restrictions or PCA-like curbs, which are basically referred to as a SAF, Supervisory Action Framework. Now, before understanding what has been the proposal of RBI, let's understand what is the concept of a prompt corrective action. Some years ago, RBI basically introduced the concept of a prompt corrective action to regulate the banking sector. Now, what is the idea of a regulation under the prompt corrective action? RBI stated that if the banks basically fail to meet certain threshold criteria or the guidelines as decided under the prompt corrective action framework, these particular banks will be coming under the coverage of PCA, they will be kept under observation and certain restrictions will be imposed on the functioning of these particular banks. Now, what were the thresholds which were decided under the concept of a prompt corrective action? Basically, banks were evaluated based on three very important parameters. One is the capital adequacy ratio, and the second parameter was non-performing assets, and the third one was a turnover or return over assets, or else it is also referred as profitability. Now, what is the concept of a capital adequacy ratio? Under the concept of a Basel guidelines, RBI has stated that each of the banks will have to maintain certain capital to absorb the losses. I'll repeat the statement. Under the ambit of Basel guidelines, each of the banks will have to maintain certain capital to absorb the losses. Now, what is the minimum capital that they're supposed to maintain is called as capital adequacy ratio. For example, under the Basel guidelines which are applicable globally, the capital adequacy ratio required is around 8%. But in case of India, since RBI is the regulator of the banking sector, it has increased this particular requirement from 8% to 9%. In simple terms, in case of India, the banks will have to maintain a capital adequacy of 9% under the Basel guidelines. So this is the first very important criteria. Whenever banks do not meet this particular capital adequacy ratio, they will be kept under prompt corrective action. And within the prompt corrective action, there were the concept of three buckets or three classifications. They call them as a risk threshold 1, risk threshold 2 and risk threshold 3. And whenever the capital adequacy ratio declines, the risk associated with the bank will keep on increasing. When the capital adequacy ratio of the banks kept on reducing, the risk increased and the classification under the risk threshold also kept on increasing. In simple terms, the lowest risk amongst all the three will be risk threshold 1 and the highest risk will be under risk threshold 3. So if a bank has got very low capital adequacy ratio, then it will basically kept under the risk threshold 3. And if it basically breaches the minimum level of a capital adequacy ratio, it will be kept under RT1, risk threshold 1. Second very important parameter was a non-performing asset. And what is a non-performing asset? A bank will issue a loan to a borrower in the market. Borrower doesn't make the repayment. From 90 days of the default of the repayment, the bank will classify this particular asset as a non-performing asset. Now, why it is referred as an asset? Please remember, for a bank, deposits are liabilities and the loans are assets. And since the recoveries of loan is not happening, basically this particular asset will be referred as a non-performing asset. So can I simply say that higher the NPS, more will be the risk associated with the bank. So higher the risk, basically it will be moved from risk threshold 1 to risk threshold 2, from 2 to third classification of risk threshold. Basically we started with NPS of 6%. If a bank has more than 6% up to 9%, it was kept under RT1, more than 9% up to 12% under RT2 and more than 12% it was kept under the RT3. And in case of the profitability or return over asset, if a bank does not make any kind of a return over asset for 2 consecutive years, it was kept under RT1. For 3 consecutive years, RT2. For 4 consecutive years or more than that, it was kept under RT3. So basically, RBI evaluated the functioning of the banks based on these three parameters, and whenever the banks failed to meet any one of the parameters or cross the thresholds in any one of the parameters, they were kept under observation under the risk threshold levels of either RT1, RT2 or RT3. Now, once you are kept under the prompt corrective action, what will happen? Once a bank comes under the prompt corrective action, basically RBI can impose restrictions on the functioning of this particular bank. And these particular restrictions were basically divided under two heads. One was referred as a mandatory restriction and the second one was referred as a discretionary restriction. Now, once you are classified under, let's say, RT1, some of the restrictions will automatically come into effect. And when you are moved from RT1 to RT2, additional restrictions will come into effect. And when you are moved from RT2 to RT3, furthermore restrictions will come into implementation. These restrictions are referred as mandatory restrictions. For example, RBI has stated that if you are kept under risk threshold 1, the bank might be asked to infuse capital. The bank's owners, which is nothing but the shareholders, the dividend payment to these particular owners might be stopped, so on and so forth. Now, apart from the mandatory restrictions, RBI also had the power to impose discretionary restrictions. What do you mean by discretionary restrictions in this particular context? RBI could simply ask the banks to stop lending. RBI could simply ask to banks to put certain restrictions with respect to withdrawals and so on and so forth. So this is a basic concept of the prompt corrective action which was implemented by RBI in case of the banking sector. Now RBI stated that this particular concept of a prompt corrective action in the revised concept of a supervisory action framework will be applicable to the urban cooperative banks. Under this particular supervisory action framework, whenever the NPAs of the UCBs cross 6% of the total assets or total net advances of this particular bank, or when they incur losses for 2 or more consecutive years, or when the capital adequacy ratio of these particular banks will fall below 9%, these will be brought under observation of SAF. And when these particular banks are kept under observation, what kind of restrictions will be imposed? One, RBI might stop a payment of dividend to the shareholders of the bank. RBI might ask the board of this particular bank to prepare a resolution plan and implement this particular plan. And in extreme cases, even RBI can ask these particular banks not to conduct any kind of lending activities. RBI might impose certain restrictions with respect to withdrawals. RBI might simply ask the permission of or the viewpoint of the board for merger of this particular UCB with another UCB. So these are some of the restrictions which have been mentioned in this particular article. And these particular restrictions are needed because in the recent times, the functioning of the urban cooperative banks has come under a lot of discussion. With more and more defaults or more and more issues or scams related to UCBs, there's a need for regulating the urban cooperative banks. So RBI has announced that the prompt corrective action like framework will also be implemented to regulate the urban cooperative banks. These are some of the points which are discussed in this particular article. Now, based on this particular discussion, let's solve a question. Consider the following statements regarding prompt corrective action. RBI imposes restrictions on the banks based on their performance in capital adequacy ratio, non-performing asset as well as profitability. Correct? Once a bank is kept under PCA, it is imposed with discretionary and mandatory restrictions. Correct. Both the options are correct. Right option here will be option C. Both the statements are true. The next article is related to capital conservation buffer. Before I understand what are the points given in the article, let's try and understand in the first place what is the concept of a capital conservation buffer. Now, under the Basel guidelines, so far 3 sets of guidelines have been implemented. Basel 1, Basel 2 and Basel 3 guidelines. Now, some of you might be hearing the term Basel for the first time. Basel is a place in Switzerland. And this particular place in Switzerland basically houses very important financial institutions. One institution is a BCBS and the second one is a BIS. India is a member of both of them. BCBS is Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and BIS stands for Bank for International Settlements. Now let's focus on BCBS. BCBS is a forum where the central bankers of member countries will participate, come out with guidelines which will help in maintaining the financial health of the banking sector. So remember this, Basel guidelines are applicable to only the banking sector. They want to maintain the financial health of the banking sector. So every now and then they'll keep on coming out with certain set of guidelines. So far, India has implemented Basel 1 guidelines. We have implemented Basel 2 guidelines. We are in the process of implementing Basel 3 guidelines. And the concept of a capital conservation buffer was mentioned under the concept of Basel 3 guidelines. Now, under the Basel 3 guidelines, what the banks need to do is they will have to maintain a certain capital adequacy ratio. We have already discussed the concept of a capital adequacy ratio. It basically refers to certain capital which has to be maintained by the banks to absorb the losses. And why do you think the banks will incur losses? Because banks are involved in lending activities in the market. If I'm a bank, if I give a loan to you, what is the guarantee that you are going to repay the loan to me? In certain situations, it might so happen that the borrowers might simply take the loan and default on the repayment of the loan. But please understand, this particular loan has been issued by the bank by collecting certain advances from the market or deposits from the market. So there is a liability on the bank. So it has collected deposits, it has issued the loan. Loan repayment has not happened, but the bank has to repay this particular deposit. In simple terms, so the bank is incurring a loss in this kind of a transaction. Now, how do you observe these particular laws? For this only, Basel 3 recommends that you must maintain a capital adequacy ratio. And apart from having just a capital adequacy ratio, one of the very important specializations of Basel 3 is it has recommended having specific amount of a tier 1 capital. Now, what is this particular idea for tier 1 capital? Please understand, the capital of a banking sector is usually divided into two. One is called as a tier 1 capital and the second one is called as tier 2 capital. Now, what is this idea for tier 1 and tier 2? Whenever a capital has got a huge amount of a liquidity or very high amount of a liquidity, usually it is kept under the concept of a tier 1 capital. For example, bank issues the shares or bonds, collects the money. Now, can I simply say this particular money collected is nothing but capital for a bank, and this particular capital which is in the form of a money will have a very huge amount of liquidity or very high liquidity. Hence, this concept is basically a tier 1 capital, the capital which has got very high liquidity. And in case of the tier 2 capital, comparatively liquidity is lesser. For example, bank can also raise capital by selling certain assets in the market, but they will realize this particular money only after selling the asset. So the liquidity feature of this particular capital is comparatively lesser. We basically keep this particular capital under the concept of tier 2 capital. The tier 1 capital is also referred as a core capital and tier 2 capital is referred as subordinated capital. Now understand this. Under the concept of Basel guidelines, the banks will have to maintain a certain capital adequacy ratio. The capital adequacy ratio that is supposed to be maintained is 9%. But beyond this also, the banks are supposed to maintain certain buffer. Now, what is the concept of a buffer? Generally, when we say buffer, buffer means something kept aside, something kept extra. In this context, the logic is, in normal situations, in normal times, the capital under the concept of a capital adequacy ratio will be sufficient to absorb the losses which is incurred by the bank. But what if there is an emergency situation? What if there is a black swan event? What do you mean by black swan event? Whenever there is a market crash at a very larger scale, these kind of events are called as a black swan event. Let me give an example. The global financial crisis which happened in 2008 and 2009 is basically referred to as a black swan event. So when these kind of a black swan events happen in the market, the losses incurred by the banks will be very, very huge. And these particular losses cannot be absorbed merely by the capital under the capital adequacy ratio. Hence, under Basel 3 guidelines, we want the banks to maintain certain extra buffer also. This particular buffer, which has to be maintained aside or apart from the capital adequacy, is called as capital conservation buffer. And under the Basel guidelines, the banks are supposed to maintain a capital conservation buffer of a 2.5% of risk-weighted assets. Now, what is the point of discussion in this particular article? We started implementing this particular concept of the Basel 3 guidelines from the year 2016 and we were supposed to finish it by 2019. That is basically financial year 2016 to financial year 2019. Now, under the concept of a capital conservation buffer, the bank has to meet the target of how much? 2.5% of risk-weighted assets. RBI basically stated that banks need not keep 2.5% in a single year like this. Banks can meet the target of 2.5% of risk-weighted assets by keeping in the form of equated transactions or equal transactions. That is, annually, the banks were supposed to transfer 0.625% of risk-weighted assets in the form of capital conservation buffer. So for 4 years, they would transfer 0.625% annually. So at the end of the fourth financial year, we would meet the target of 2.5% of the risk-weighted assets. Now, what is the concept here? If you are keeping aside certain capital annually like this, it also means that this capital is not available for the banks to lend in the market. So understand this. When the banks were asked to keep aside the capital annually in the form of 0.625% of RWA, that is risk-weighted assets, this capital was unavailable for the banking sector to lend in the market. Now, in the year, that is a financial year 2019, RBI stated that the fourth tranche or the fourth installment of a 0.625%, which was supposed to be transferred by the banking sector, RBI gave a relaxation to the banks and stated that you can take 1 more year to transfer this particular last tranche or the fourth tranche of the capital conservation buffer. I'll repeat the concept here. It's technical. So understand this. In financial year 2016, we transferred 0.625. 17, we transferred 0.625. 18, we transferred 0.625. And in financial year 19, we were supposed to transfer 0.625. But in 2019, the banking sector was under a lot of pressure. So RBI stated, rather than asking you to transfer in this year only, take 1 more year to transfer this particular 0.625% of RWA in the CCB. Now, what is the logic here? If I give you a relaxation for 1 more year, if I extend the time period by 1 more year, can I simply say that the banks in 2019 could use this particular amount of a capital to lend in the market? Yes. And please understand, when the banks will keep on lending, the money will keep on getting created or credit will keep on getting created into the market. For example, here is a bank. It will give a loan to a businessman. What will the businessman do with the loan? He will take the money, go to the market, purchase raw materials, and he will pay this particular money to a vendor. Now, what will the vendor do? Take the money, put it in a bank or submit the check to the bank. So, money has again entered into a bank. Bank will take the same money, issue it in the form of a loan to, let's say, a buyer in a market who will purchase a house. So, when the buyer takes a loan from the bank, he will pay to the developer of the house. So, money is getting created or credit is getting created into the market. As per this particular article, for financial year 2019, the banks were supposed to transfer around 37,000 crore rupees as a fourth installment under the buffer. And since RBI extended the time period, relaxed the time period for 1 more year, banks use this particular 37,000 crore rupees to lend in the market. As a result of which, the total lending in the market or credit in the market increased by 3.5 lakh crore rupees or 3.5 trillion rupees. Now, the deadline is fast approaching. That is, the banks are supposed to meet this particular target of 2.5% of RWA by 31st March 2020. And when they are supposed to meet this particular target, it means that they will have to take this particular money, keep it in the form of a capital conservation buffer. And when they keep it in the form of a capital conservation buffer, it also means this money is not available for credit creation in the market. Here comes the problem. In the present situation, there's a huge amount of a slowdown in the domestic market. We want the banking sector to issue more and more credit in the market so that more credit will lead to more production. More production means what? More demand in the market, and there's a virtuous cycle of the GDP growth rate which will be created in the market. But if the banks do not have this much amount of money to lend in the market, it means this much amount of credit will also be not created, which might further basically affect the slowdown in the domestic market. Apart from this, another very important concern is if 37,000 crore rupees is taken out of the banking sector like this, it also means the government of India has to look into this to provide for recapitalization in the banking sector in the upcoming budget. So these are some of the very important points which have been discussed under this particular article. Now based on this, let's solve a question. Consider the following statements about CCB. CCB is a part of Basel 1 guidelines. Wrong, it is part of Basel 3 guidelines. CCB applicable for public sector banks is 2.5% of risk weighted assets. Correct. So right option will be option B. Only second statement is true. Next article is related to ration card portability. Now please understand, Government of India has introduced a National Food Security Act, under which they are going to provide food security through the concept of a public distribution system. Under the NFSA, they are going to basically sell or issue food grains, that is rice at 3 rupee per kg, wheat at 2 rupee per kg, and coarse grains at 1 rupee per kg. And under NFSA, we are going to cover around 2/3 of total India's population, right, within which 50% of urban population will be covered and 75% of rural population will be covered. And each of the beneficiary is going to be identified by the state government, and we are going to issue a ration card to him. He can get access to 5 kgs of food grains every month under this particular concept. Now I am using the term 5 kg per person or per beneficiary. Some of the books will mention 25 kg per family, because under the concept of NFSA, the maximum allocation of a beneficiaries per family will be 5 people. So you can simply say either 5 kg per beneficiary or 25 kg maximum per family per month. Now apart from this, there is a concept of the portability here, which is discussed in the article. Now what do you mean by portability? Now understand this, as per census 2011, around 14 crore people in case of India are migrating. This particular migration could be intrastate or could be interstate. Now the question is, why are they migrating? They are migrating from one place to another place within the same state or beyond this particular state in search of livelihood. Seasonally, they'll keep on migrating from one place to another place. Now the problem is, if I am a beneficiary in one of the state, that is specifically in one of the districts, I am issued with the ration card. Now this particular ration card is not useful for me if I move out of this particular district or into another state, because in another state they are not going to issue any kind of food grains to me until unless I register again in the second state or in the second place. Now since more than 14 crore people annually keep on migrating like this, it is very difficult for them to get access to the food grains under the concept of National Food Security Act. And it has been found that the process to get registered in a new place is a very cumbersome process. As a result of this, huge amount of people moving from one state to another state, moving from one place to another place, do not go through the concept of registering again to get another ration card to get food grains in the second place also. This is basically affecting the food security situation in case of India. To overcome this particular situation, Government of India has proposed the concept of a ration card portability. That is basically, Government of India will be installing EPOS machines throughout India. In all the ration shops or fair price shops, they are going to install this particular machinery, and using your credentials, you can get the same entitlement whether you are in the same state or in a different state because of migration. Now this particular concept is referred to as ration card portability. Now so far, Government of India in last year has introduced this particular ration card portability in some of the states where it is only applicable within this particular state, that is intrastate. And in some of the states such as Karnataka, they have also introduced interstate portability. Now government has stated that by June 2020, they will ensure that this concept of a ration card portability will be extended to pan-India. That is, all the states will be covered under the concept of ration card portability. Now what is the advantage because of this? I have already mentioned it. If you move from one place to another place, you need not be worried about getting registered again. The concept of a ration card portability will help you in getting access to the food grains. This will definitely help the migrant workers who will keep on moving from one place to another place in search of their livelihood. But having said so, there are certain concerns which have been raised against this particular concept of the ration card portability also. Some of the concerns are: one, if you want to ensure that this concept of a ration card portability will be applicable throughout India, that is pan-India, you need to ensure that all the fair price shops will have this kind of an infrastructure of EPOS, that is e-point of sales infrastructure. And this infrastructure of EPOS has been installed so far only in 4.3 lakh fair price shops. Whereas as per Government of India, there are more than 5.3 lakh fair price shops in case of India. So it means that there are around 1 lakh fair price shops which are yet to be installed with this particular infrastructure. That's the first one. Second one, the migration is very seasonal in case of India. And since it is seasonal, the allocation of food grains to these particular fair price shops should also be dynamic. That has to be taken into consideration before introducing the concept of a ration card portability pan-India. And the third very important concern which has been raised with respect to this concept is the government of India needs to develop a server or needs to develop a system where they will have to find out what is the present location of the worker. Because the migrant workers will keep on moving from one place to another place, this particular concept of finding the location of the migrant worker is very, very important. Otherwise, it might lead to the duplication of the beneficiaries in the system. That is the precise reason Government of India stated that they are developing a database of these particular migrant workers, which will help them in identifying the movement of the migrant laborers as such. So these are some of the very important points related to the concept of ration card portability. And just for sake of information, this article also states that so far in case of India, under NFSA, around 81.3 crore beneficiaries have been covered. Now, based on this particular discussion, let's have a look at a question here. The National Food Security Act was enacted by Ministry of Agriculture, wrong. Ministry of Human Resource and Development, no. Ministry of Food Processing and Industries, wrong. The right option will be Ministry of Food and Public Distribution. Another question, consider the following statements about National Food Security Act. It provides food grains, that is rice, wheat and coarse grains at 3 rupee per kg. Wrong. Rice at 3 rupee per kg, wheat at 2 rupee per kg and coarse grains at 1 rupee per kg. It covers 50% of the total population. Wrong. It covers 2/3 of total population. Right option will be option D. Both statements are false. The next article is related to FDI in coal mining. Now please understand, earlier Government of India nationalized the concept of coal mining. Now what do you mean by nationalization? The Government of India will start owning the idea of a coal mining or the coal mines in case of India. The government earlier nationalized the coal mines, but in recent times has started allowing the participation of the private sector in coal mining activities. But so far, that is until 2018, the concept of coal mining was only related to concept of captive coal mining. Now what do you mean by captive coal mining? Let's assume there is a private sector company X which is allowed to mine the coal. But this particular mining of a coal which is done by this particular private sector company has to be used only for certain purposes. Or in simple terms, for what purpose this coal has to be used will be dictated by Government of India. And whatever is the excess coal which has been mined out by this particular private sector will not be allowed to be sold in the open market. That is in simple terms, end use restrictions were imposed by the government. This is referred as a captive coal mining. And this is important because please understand there are private sector entities which are involved in steel manufacturing, iron manufacturing or iron sector, are involved in cement manufacturing, so on and so forth. And these particular companies actually require coal. So either these particular private sector companies or subsidiaries of these particular private sector companies were allowed to participate in auctioning of coal mines and purchase these particular coal mines, and whatever coal they mine will be used for these particular uses only, which is nothing but end use restrictions. Apart from this, earlier there was also restriction on whether the private sector companies which are foreign companies are allowed to participate in auctioning or not. That is in simple terms, if a foreign coal miner or a foreign company which is involved in coal mining wants to participate in auctioning of the coal mines, it has to have certain operational coal mines in case of India. I'll repeat the statement. If there's a foreign company which wants to participate and bid for these particular coal mines, it needs to have certain coal mines already functioning in case of India or which are operated by this particular foreign company. That was another restriction which was imposed by the foreign coal miners in terms of a participation in the coal mining sector. Very recently, Government of India has amended two acts, the Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act of 1957 and Coal Mines Special Provisions Act of 2015. It has issued an ordinance amending these particular two acts, and with this particular amendment, it is expected that the FDI in coal mining will be allowed, and not only this, private sector participation in the coal mining will be allowed. And more importantly, The point here is these particular private sector companies, when they mine out the coal, there will be no restrictions with respect to end use of this particular coal. That is, in simple terms, these particular private sector entities can mine the coal and sell the coal in the open market. Now, what is the objective of Government of India? Why did Government of India introduce this particular concept? Objective is very simple. India imports a huge amount of coal. As per the data given by various experts, last year alone, India imported coal to the tune of around 235 million tons. Out of this particular 235 million tons, around 135 million tons of the coal could have been mined out in case of India. And please also understand this, India has got the fifth largest coal reserves in the world. And as of now, the biggest coal miner in India, which is allowed to sell the coal in the open market, is Coal India Limited, which is owned by Government of India. Now, the problem here has been that Coal India Limited has not been able to satisfy the demand of a coal in the domestic market. And since there is a shortfall of a supply compared to the demand of coal in the domestic market, India imports huge amount of coal. We want to reduce our dependence on the coal or the import of coal. And one of the ways of reducing this particular dependence will be what? To promote domestic mining or domestic production of coal itself. And Government of India has introduced this particular reform to ensure that India will achieve a production of 1 billion tons of coal by 23 and 24. So this is the objective. But having said so, will it attract huge amount of a private sector participation? Because please understand, in 2018 itself or 1 year ago itself, Government of India opened up the coal mining to a certain extent to the domestic private sector coal miners. But so far, whatever auctions have been conducted, the domestic private sector coal miners have not shown any kind of enthusiasm or participation in these particular auctions. Some of the issues which have not been addressed by Government of India so far with respect to coal mining are: one, whenever a private sector will bid for a coal mine, it wins the coal mine in an auction, it has to make a huge amount of upfront payment for this particular coal mine. The problem here is the private sector is very much worried about making this particular payment upfront itself. That is a precise reason, despite allowing the domestic private sector participants in the coal mining sector, there has been no enthusiasm shown by these particular companies. This has not been addressed. One. Second one, various experts have criticized Government of India, saying that on one side you are promoting the production of renewable energy, and on the other side you are basically promoting the production of more and more coal, which is a fossil fuel, which will contribute to environmental pollution. But having said so, Government of India says requirement of a coal is very, very high in case of India, not only for power sector but also for various other sectors also. Hence, we are promoting the domestic production. Third one, by promoting this particular concept of a coal mining, we expect foreign companies to come into India, invest heavily in the infrastructure. But to invest heavily in this kind of a mining infrastructure, they need loans. Banking sector is not expected to give these kind of loans in the coal mines. Because please understand, there has been certain issues in the banking sector also with respect to their assets, that is loans. Now, apart from this, what about the land acquisition issue? Has Government of India made any kind of a framework with respect to easy acquisition of the land? What about the transportation infrastructure? Do we have efficient transportation infrastructure? So all these are the structural issues which were affecting coal mining and which will continue to affect the coal mining in case of India. So the government, by announcing FDI in coal mining, has addressed only one part of the issue, whereas other structural issues will continue to have an impact on the mining sector. So these are some of the points which are associated with this particular article. The next article is associated with the promotion of agriculture exports. Now please understand, Government of India has set up an objective or a target of doubling the income of the farmers by 2022. Now one of the ways to achieve this particular target of doubling the income of the farmers is to ensure that there is a huge amount of export of agriculture commodities from the domestic market to the international market. Now, what has been the situation of agriculture exports from India to the rest of the world? The agriculture exports accounted for $7.5 billion worth of exports in the year 2003-2004. And this particular number increased from $7.5 billion to $43.2 billion by 2013-2014. But after this, there has been a decline in the agri exports from India, but very recently it has recovered to $39 billion by 2018 and 2019. And in these particular years, In certain periods of time, there has been sudden spike in agriculture exports, but this particular spike has not been sustainable or has not sustained over a period of time. So this is one point. Second point, one of the issues with respect to promotion of agriculture exports has been that there are multiple agencies which are promoting agriculture exports from India. For example, there is a APEDA, there is a MPEDA, there is a board for spices, there is a board for coffee, there is a board for tea. In simple terms, there are multiple authorities or regulatory agencies which are promoting the exports of agriculture commodities. This author basically says rather than having multiple agencies, why don't we have only one agency to promote agriculture exports of any kind from India to the rest of the world? Let this particular agency function under Ministry of Commerce. Let it report to the Ministry of Commerce. What are the advantages of having a single agency? Rather than having multiple agencies, we will have a single agency. So there will be a synergy, or there will be a uniformity, or there is only one authority which is deciding the export policy for all these particular commodities. Second, this authority can enter into negotiations with other authorities of other countries, enter into agreements with other countries, promote free trade agreements between India with these particular countries in the agriculture sector, which basically will promote agriculture exports from India to the rest of the world. So this has been one very important issue as well as a recommendation by this particular author. Second issue which has been flagged in this particular article is availability of infrastructure. Now what kind of infrastructure they are referring to here? Infrastructure which is involved in sampling, testing of these particular agriculture commodities. Because please understand, whenever we want to promote agriculture exports from India to, let's say, rest of the world, there are strict standards with respect to what kind of a phytosanitary measures we are supposed to meet in terms of promoting agriculture exports. So we do not have sufficient infrastructure in terms of sampling and testing of these particular agriculture commodities. So recommendation is we need to develop this kind of an infrastructure. That's the second very important issue mentioned in this particular article. Third very important issue is the promotion of the exports of GI products. Government of India so far has allocated the GI tag for more than 300 items. Out of these particular 320 plus items, there are 120 agriculture commodities which have been given the GI tag. The export of these particular commodities has not been promoted by the government. Out of all these 100 plus commodities which have received a GI tag under agriculture sector, the export of Darjeeling tea is being promoted. Or this is the only agriculture product which has a GI tag, and the export of this particular product is promoted especially to the European Union market. So the argument here is, why don't we take this particular 120 agriculture commodities which have received the GI tag, promote the exports of these particular commodities? These are some of the recommendations which have been given in this particular article. Now based on this particular discussion, let's have a look at the question here. Consider the following statements regarding agriculture exports. Government has issued GI tag for more than 300 items, of which 120 are agri commodities. Yes, this is correct. Darjeeling tea has been given the GI tag. Yes, this is also correct. So right option will be option C. Both are true. The next article is related to safeguard duties. Government of India in the year 2018 announced the concept of imposition of safeguard duties on solar photovoltaic modules. In simple terms, the panels, cells and panels which are being imported into India. Now the very important point you must understand is, India is heavily dependent on these particular modules or imports of these particular modules. At one point of a time, that is before the imposition of these particular safeguard duties, India imported more than 80% of the SPV modules into India. In recent times, the import of these particular modules has been affected. But having said so, majority of these particular exports of SPV modules into India will flow from Malaysia and more importantly from China. Apart from these two countries, the country of Vietnam is also emerging as one of the very important exporter of these particular modules in the recent days. Now what is the concept here? Government of India implemented safeguard duties. These are the taxes which are imposed on the imports above and over the normal customs duties. Government of India basically imposed safeguard duties for a period of 2 years. In the first year, the safeguard duty applicable will be 25%. For the next 6 months, it will be brought down to 20%, and finally for remaining 6 months, it will be further brought down to 15%. So in 2020, these particular safeguard duties which are imposed on the imports of SPV modules from Malaysia and China are going to expire. And now Government of India is thinking of extending these particular safeguard duties for further period also. What is the argument given in this particular article? It has been stated that some of the exporters of China have basically routed these particular SPV modules from other countries. For example, China has an agreement with Vietnam and it has leveraged this particular agreement with Vietnam to route their SPV modules from Vietnam into India. That has been one concern. And second very important point of discussion is that there's a huge potential for growth of solar energy in case of India. And Government of India wants to ensure that the solar domestic manufacturers or SPV manufacturers in the domestic market will be able to earn revenues because of this particular potential growth in the coming days. This has been mentioned in the form of a reduction in the value of imports in case of India. For example, the value of SPV imports for the financial year 18 in case of India were around $3.8 billion. But for this particular fiscal, this has been reduced or this has fallen down to $1.4 billion. So there is a huge potential for the solar energy sector because Government of India wants to achieve 100 gigawatts of capacity under solar energy by 2022. And Government of India also wants to ensure that it is the solar SPV module manufacturers in the domestic market who will benefit from this particular sector as such. Hence, Government of India is thinking of extending the imposition of these particular safeguard duties. Now, based on this particular discussion, let's have a look at a question here. Consider the following statements. India has set a target of creating capacity of 100 gigawatts of solar energy by 2022. Correct. Major SPU module exporting countries to India are US and Thailand. Wrong. It is China and Malaysia. And now Vietnam. So, only first statement is correct. Right option will be option A. So these are some of the very important articles as well as the questions based on these particular articles for this particular time period. Thank you. Have a good day.